Oliver, you didn't stop there.
Oh,
Switch 1 versus Switch 2, because we got a couple of comparisons here talking, specifically looking at Switch 1 versus Switch 2 Special Edition.
yes. The first game I thought I'd start with here is our kind of 4K 60 behemoth in Metroid Prime 4, specifically its Switch 2 edition, because Nintendo has supplied 2 sets of press quality assets to us for this. One is for the Switch 1 version and one is for Switch 2. So it's only about 12 seconds of footage matching, but it does match perfectly. It's a little cutscene sequence here. So the biggest difference by far comes down to image quality. The Switch 1 version looks kind of blocky, imprecise, aliased, and the Switch 2 looks quite 4K-like. In the Switch 2, again, it counts in at 4K, and all the shots that I tested, Switch 1 counts at 900p. So Switch 2 looks a lot better, I think, here. Texture detail does resolve more sharply on Switch 2, but in a lot of these comparisons, it's a little bit hard to tell whether that comes down to actually higher grade texture assets or whether it comes down more to, higher res rendering and mip mapping and whatnot. The light maps do seem pretty similar in resolution across the 2 versions, but I do think there may be some high resolution textures on like Samus's gun, and Nintendo also states there are some texturing differences between the 2 versions, so perhaps there is a significant difference there. We also have some footage of the game running at 1080p 120 supplied by Nintendo.
Oh, wow.
Yes, which does actually seem to be 1080p 120 in my counts, so that is pretty solid. And so you could pick between 4K 60 and 1080p 120 here, which is probably going to be tough for a lot of people. I think those are 2 very competitive offerings. In either case, you're getting a much better experience than you would on an original Switch unit. And then there's Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So this isn't actually a comparison that I put together myself. This comes down to the Nintendo Treehouse that was published today, their live show, and I captured it from that live show. And here, the key difference comes down to resolution. They're playing the original Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild Switch 2 edition on the right there. And the game seems to be running at about 1440p on Switch 2 again, 900p on Switch 1. But it's also running at double the frame rate, which is quite nice. And I think it's a pretty tremendous upgrade overall. And in the Korok Forest, which is an area where the OG Switch, you can see in this footage, it's running pretty poorly. I think in Digital Foundry's original coverage, it was like clocked in at about 25 FPS or so. It was not running too well in that area. Switch 2 is acing it with a stable 60 FPS. And again, the textures here do look quite a bit better. Here, I suspect it's mostly coming down to that higher res rendering. Nintendo did not highlight any texture art improvements, and obviously it's a game that's been out of production for a long time now. Maybe they didn't have the opportunity to author and save those higher resolution bits of texture art and things like that. That might not have been possible for this porting effort. And obviously it's a much older title here. Looking at other elements like distant LODs and things like that, they look pretty similar for both systems there. Foliage looks similar. So those are visual elements where there is some continuity. It's really just the resolution change and the frame rate change, but there's also a significant change to loading times. A load across the map here takes about 4 seconds on Switch 2, about 12 seconds on the original Switch. So a big improvement to loading times, roughly in line with what we've seen from a lot of efforts this generation on current generation consoles, where loading times maybe are not being eliminated, but practically speaking, they're being decimated to a level where it's actually very, very reasonable and where you're not really going to be bothered by it. And again, this is a Switch 2 edition title that presumably is maybe not taking full advantage of, say, file decompression and whatnot here. That could also be another possibility, right? So only up from here, possibly there. But yeah, just 2 titles that show there is indeed quite a large gulf between the Switch 1 and Switch 2. Incomparable titles here, you're getting a much better experience on Switch 2.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the loading time comparison with Breath of the Wild there, obviously loading is a factor of 2 things. It's the speed of the storage and also the speed of the CPU in terms of decompression, assuming the CPU is actually being used on the Switch 2 as opposed to the file decompression block, which basically frees up the CPU in that regard and is like a fixed function block that does the job. We don't really know which one is being used there. I think on a more general level, I'm really interested in seeing how the loading times just operate in general across a range of titles there. to see how that works, because obviously we are moving to a different generation now, and you kind of need all of that stuff to be as streamlined as possible to give a console-like experience, which back in the day on PS4 on a 5400 RPM mechanical drive was a bit of a disaster area in many games. But certainly this is looking quite nice. Yeah. So also Metroid Prime, going back to that in terms of the texture upgrades. I mean, obviously the Switch 2's got a lot more memory than the Switch 1. So, I'd love to see texture upgrades on a range of games. I'm sure there's got to be more special edition Switch 2 upgrades coming, because there's a lot of games that Nintendo has in its library that it can resell effectively, or charge an upgrade fee for. We still don't know what the upgrade fees actually are, but we know that the games are full price if you buy them as full retail packages or whatever, as opposed to upgrades. Any thoughts on that, Alex?
Well, I'm watching this Metroid Prime 120 FPS footage, and I'm actually loving it. It's incredible. I just it's like when we talk about stuff being most similar to a PS4, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think this game has a lot of Xbox 360 level kind of stuff in it. We commonly compare it to Halo 4, and I think this looks a lot like Halo 4.
Yep.
But then you look at Halo 4 as presented in the Master Chief Collection on something like Xbox One, it is nothing like this. It doesn't go nearly as far as this. And you look at the stuff that had to be brought into Halo 5, like the animation decimation, to make that run at 60 FPS on an Xbox One level CPU. We don't see any evidence of that at all here. Actually, all the animations are really great. Only a handful of particle effects animate at 30 for some reason, which is odd because the game never targeted that. But that's more like the flip book asset they made for it. Just doesn't have enough interstitial frames. There's ways to get around that in games, but they just don't have that obviously implemented because that's shading cost. But yeah, I thought that's really cool. Another thing about loading to think about always too is that if a game was designed around something that was already slow from one perspective, like the SD card interface of the original Nintendo Switch, then the developers who have their own engines on that platform, maybe they don't care actually if loading is super multi-threaded anyway, because it's just limited by this one aspect. And then when they're translated over Switch 2, which now actually has maybe a much better CPU, that maybe it's wider in a lot of aspects, and the throughput now is radically different, then you'll all of a sudden start seeing games that are single thread limited in loading, when maybe they wouldn't have been if they were designed from the ground up for the Switch 2. We kind of saw that when PS5 games came out, or even Xbox Series X games came out, and we had the backwards compatibility there, and we saw some games getting big upgrades but other ones not, in spite of these generational uplifts in hardware. So software can get in the way for some of these things too.
Yeah, another thing to point out is that some games, when they were ported from PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5, they had their own sort of bespoke streaming systems that weren't easily ported to the PlayStation 5 file decompression block. And so they just were not ported at all, and they just leaned into the SSD only. Whereas, you'd hope to actually see games using all of the elements of the hardware. It's not always viable.
Yeah, and one other wrinkle here possibly is that we don't have very firm ideas about the clock behavior on Switch 2. On Switch 1, if you were loading a game like in Super Mario Odyssey, it could go up to, I think, 1.7, 1.78, something like that, gigahertz there. On Switch 2, presumably they have a lot of thermal headroom on that when they're just loading a scene, when they're not really tapping into the GPU for anything meaningful. Would they have the opportunity to juice the CPU to 2 gigahertz, to even 3 gigahertz or something, just for that purpose, to have super, super fast loads in these titles? That's another possibility that we'll have to hopefully get some documentation on. Hopefully we can see that in the future, but for now it's kind of a black box for us in terms of that loading speed.
Yeah, I think Nintendo would be hoping that developers use the file, the actual hardware that they committed to use it. But yeah, that it was kind of referred to at the time as a sort of quote unquote boost mode for the original Switch, the way it worked is that, the CPU went up to like, I think 1.785 gigahertz, but the GPU was downclocked to like virtually nothing because, why do you need high GPU speeds on a loading screen? So that was kind of the way they tackled the thermals on that one. That was quite an interesting solution to that.